This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 84. Welcome to the 84th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I started this podcast because I believe that every woman has the right to know exactly how her body and her fertility works. I'm here to connect you with the tools and information that you need to improve your menstrual cycle health and fertility. And I feel so privileged to be able to share my passion for body literacy and fertility awareness with you every single week. Fertility awareness is so much more than just birth control or trying to get pregnant, because it truly gives you a window into your health and fertility. And I love sharing my expertise with my clients and helping them to understand their charts and connect with their cycles. If you've recently discovered fertility awareness, but you're not feeling confident about using it for birth control just yet, or if you've been charting for a while and you're having trouble making sense of what's happening in your cycle, I can help. Get started today with a free 15-minute consultation with me by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/coaching, or just click the Work With Me button on my website. And I would also like to invite you to sign up for the Fertility Friday newsletter so that you're the first to know whenever I release a new podcast episode or blog post. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/ebook, and as a gift to you, you'll receive a free copy of my new ebook where I reveal what to expect when coming off of hormonal contraceptives, and I share 5 steps to restoring healthy menstrual cycles post-pill. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Dr. Dan Kalish, to the show. Dr. Kalish developed his own model of functional medicine based on over 20 years of successful clinical results, working with over 8,000 patients in his private practice. He has certified over 700 practitioners worldwide in the Kalish method, which solves patient challenges through a proven lab-based mentorship program, which addresses hormones, gastrointestinal issues, and detoxification. He has trained practitioners from Dr. Mercola's medical staff to Mayo Clinic physicians with his protocols. Dr. Kalish is also the author of 2 books, The Kalish Method, Healing the Body, Mapping the Mind, and Your Guide to Healthy Hormones. So you've been really busy. Do you sleep?
Yeah, I do actually. A little bit.
All right. And in today's show, we'll be talking about adrenal fatigue and how it relates to fertility and hormonal balance. We'll also be talking about Dr. Kalish's approach to identifying and addressing hormonal imbalances in his practice. So without further ado, welcome to the show.
Well, glad to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on the show. So before we delve into the topics of the day, I would just love to hear a little bit about how you started in the field of functional medicine and what made you take that path.
Well, when I was 23, my father got diagnosed with cancer, and then he died like 3 weeks later. And it was clear that he got all the appropriate medical care, and he had really good doctors. I mean, they were great doctors. That wasn't the problem. And I just realized at that moment that, if I was going to survive into a healthy late adulthood, that I would need to figure out how to take care of myself in a way that was outside of the conventional medical system. And his father, my grandfather, also died in his early 50s. So I had kind of a sense of urgency to figure out, what's a non-conventional medical way to figure out your health, because clearly by the time my dad and my grandfather were diagnosed with cancer, it was too late. And so that kind of motivated me to look at ideas like prevention and wellness care. And then I stumbled across functional medicine, and to me it was kind of the best of all these things put together, because it was science-based, but it had a really strong way that you could use it in a preventive manner. And I think that's kind of the hallmark of the way I look at functional medicine, is like wellness programs, prevention programs, trying to find problems before they flare up into a significant health crisis.
Well, that's a really powerful story. I always find it interesting to find out how people kind of found their way into the work that they do. But I'm sorry to hear that it had to be through tragedy. And so going into the topics of the day, a lot of my listeners are women who are kind of in that age where many of them are trying to get pregnant, and that's what prompts them to kind of do a search and find me. And many of them have been trying for a while without success. And so one of the topics that I haven't really addressed too much on the podcast yet is adrenal fatigue and how that can impair or impact a woman's fertility. So maybe we could start just by kind of, because I think people hear this adrenal fatigue so much and it doesn't really mean anything anymore, but just because it's spoken about so much. But maybe let's just get into it. What is adrenal fatigue?
Yeah, so it's a pretty non-specific term. I think it actually means different things to different people, but it means something very specific to me, because my teacher was one of the first people to really assess the adrenal hormones using this specific kind of lab testing that we do in functional medicine. So, the lineage that I was trained in, these doctors went, kind of an interesting story, late 70s, early 1980s, they went to Germany and they found at a trade show in Germany these salivary hormone test kits that weren't really available in the US, at least not in the integrative health market, and they kits, they came back to the United States and they set up a lab company in Dr. Ilias's garage in Los Angeles, and they just started running these tests. And then those two men, Timmons and Ilias, ended up creating their own rather large and well-known lab companies many years later. And their early assessments were basically looking at testing what we call the HPA axis. So that's a fancy way of saying your brain communicates with your adrenal glands, the hypothalamus and pituitary in the brain tell your adrenal glands what to do. So if you're about to get hit by a car and you're crossing the street, your brain pretty quickly tells your adrenal glands to make hormones and other kind of compounds that motivate us, right? We get this adrenaline rush, adrenals, obviously, named for where it's made, and we get this rush of cortisol, and all these things happen to motivate us to run away from the car that's about to hit us. But so the brain is basically directing the adrenaline. And if you're stuck in a situation where you're under stress for long periods of time, like you're crossing the street every day and you almost get hit by a car every single day, that could be something like a job that you don't like, or a bad marriage, or maybe you're binging on ice cream every night. You're doing something every day on a regular basis that your brain interprets as a stress. You're going to end up exhausting the body's ability to produce all these different stress hormones. And then the stress hormones start to plummet, and then people start to get tired. And then it's okay because now we have energy drinks to bring everything back up. And there's one place in my hometown where, and this is true, where you can stand and you can see 3 Starbucks from one place. Like, they're so closely packed together. So, people are exhausted, right? And they're turning towards things like caffeine and sugar to try to get that normal sense of, adrenal health that we all need. So the balance between how much you're stressed and then how often you have time to recover and rest determines the ability of the adrenal glands to function normally. But it's important to note that it's all being dictated by the brain, right? The adrenal glands aren't doing this on their own. Adrenal fatigue is really a brain problem. It's the brain under stress signaling out to all these different organ systems to respond.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you described, then the way that our brain controls how these hormones are excreted based on what's happening, it's very much the same way that the brain controls the hormones that are excreted that control a woman's menstrual cycle. And so if a woman is experiencing these stressors that are then, causing these problems, how does that relate to her menstrual cycle? What are some ways that it can impact the healthy functioning of her menstrual cycle?
Well, the main hormones that we're talking about, there's sort of 2 categories of chemicals that the adrenal glands make, right? There's the adrenal cortex. That's the outer part of the adrenal gland. And it makes a hormone called cortisol. It's named for the cortex. So it was like if you're looking at a walnut, the adrenal glands are actually like the size of a walnut, but the cortex would be the outer part. Like on a walnut, it would be the shell, right? And then the inner part of the adrenal gland is called the medulla. That'd be like the center of the walnut, the part that you actually want to eat. So the medulla makes these chemical compounds that are called catecholamines, and they include things like adrenaline, noradrenaline, and dopamine. And we also call those same chemicals, it's a little confusing, but some scientists call them epinephrine, which means the same thing as adrenaline, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So catecholamines are made from the inside of the adrenal glands, cortisol is made from the outside. And when we're stressed, we release all these chemicals at the same time in order to create different kinds of responses. Now, the way that the female hormones get linked into this is that cortisol is produced from the same precursors that we make progesterone and estrogen from. And so as people are more and more stressed and they make more and more cortisol to respond to the stress, it interferes with the brain's ability to produce or to signal to the ovaries to properly produce progesterone and estrogen. And so the more stressed a woman becomes and the more dysfunctional her cortisol and adrenal hormone production becomes, the more dysfunctional her ovarian hormone output. And her that also affects thyroid too. So when we're really high in cortisol, women tend to experience low levels of the sex hormones, progesterone and estrogen, and low levels of thyroid hormone all at the same time. Bad combination.
Yeah, definitely. And, for women who are charting their cycles, some of the women that I work with, you kind of see how, you see the results of that. So you just see limited production of cervical mucus. You see short luteal phases. So those are kind of indicators of low estrogen and progesterone. And one of the things that you touched on is the stressors. I mean, I think people kind of get the big obvious stressors on the body. So we get that if we're almost hit by a car, we're going to feel stressed. But what are some, and you mentioned eating ice cream. And I think that's a really good example of some of the other not so obvious stressors on the body that people wouldn't necessarily think are causing stress on the body. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those stressors to kind of put them on our radar. Like, what else is stressing us out so much?
Yeah, so let's say that for some reason let's say you were like Dr. Evil, and you're in like this world of women, and you're Mrs. Evil, you're Dr. Evil, but you're a woman, you're like Josephine Evil, and you decide that you want to create infertility everywhere that you can so that you can destroy the human race or something like that. And you want to get a plan together that's going to absolutely guaranteed interfere with female hormone production. Okay, so there's 3 things that you would do if you're a Dr. Evil in this position. And they all involve the stress response in the adrenal glands, right? You would, number 1, want to create a lot of emotional stress because that drives cortisol up and progesterone and estrogen down. Number 2, you would want to create a massive amount of unstable blood sugar problems because cortisol is a glucocorticosteroid. It's a blood sugar stabilizing hormone. And when we eat sugar, thrashes your cortisol levels, thrashes the female hormone cycle as well. And then the third thing, if you were really evil, if you were like Dr. Evil and you wanted to get everyone to never get pregnant again, you would create all the women were inflamed. So cortisol responds to emotional stress, dietary stress, and inflammatory stress. And by inflammation in functional medicine is kind of code word for problems with your digestive tract and problems with environmental toxins in your liver. So those are the 3 biggies: emotional, dietary, and inflammatory stress all contribute. And if they get to be enough stress accumulates between those 3 things, emotional, dietary, and inflammatory stress, then the female hormone levels drop like a rock and women can't get pregnant. And all these years also of testing female hormones, never had a case where the female hormones dysfunctioned all on their own in isolation from the rest of the body. Right? The ovaries are the victim in this, right? The ovaries are responding with abnormal hormone output because of emotional, dietary, or inflammatory stress. It's not the other way around. You don't just wake up one morning and your ovaries think, oh, I'm going to make this really hard to get pregnant thing for you, It's their ovaries responding to these 3 different variables that throws the female hormones off consistently.
I think that's so interesting and tragic. I mean, I think on the one hand, I don't know that many people who maybe wouldn't say every now and then I have an addiction to sugar. It's like thrown around as a joke, like I'm addicted to chocolate, or, I really need to eat ice cream, or whatever it is. But, so many people have that kind of addiction to sugar. And I think that the last thing you think is that it's an actual stressor on your body. And it could be messing up your hormones. I think the connection between sugar and hormonal imbalance is obviously starting to be more well known, but your average person just likes their ice cream.
Well, yeah, and it works the other way as well. I mean, people eat sugar because their hormones are messed up, and sugar messes up their hormones both, right? Because if you have really stable blood sugar every day, there's no attraction to sugar. If the hormones are keeping insulin and cortisol and glucagon, all the different hormones that regulate your blood sugar, if they're working properly, sugar is just like a, maybe I'll have it, maybe I won't kind of thing. But if your blood sugar is fluctuating up and down, it's inconsistent, then you almost have to have sugar just to feel okay. And people use it as a mood stabilizer.
Mm-hmm. Well, and How does sleep play into this? Does sleep affect your stress levels or lack thereof, I guess I should say?
Yeah. Now, if Dr. Evil was really going to make this just absolutely destructive infertility program, then disrupting sleep would be one of the key components, because when we're sleeping, we're going through rest and recovery, and all the things that we're talking about, emotional stress, dietary stress, and inflammatory stress, the body's trying to repair all those things during sleep. And if you get enough rest and recovery, you can offset the damage that's happening in the rest of your life. And that's kind of how we're designed, right? And if your sleep cycles get disrupted, then that's going to be, and is oftentimes one of the major contributors to the cortisol circadian rhythm being out of balance, and then the female hormones suffering. I didn't mention that, so let me back up a step. When we look at cortisol in these tests, we do these 4 samples throughout the day, and it measures your circadian rhythm or your sleep pattern, right? It's this pattern where cortisol levels peak in the morning, and then they drop to really low levels at night, and that's controlled by our exposure to light and dark. Okay, and that rhythm is basically, impacted by blood sugar related issues, it's impacted by stress, and it's really profoundly going to control whether you're getting enough sleep and good quality sleep or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so then one of the questions I would want to ask you, because I talk to lots of my listeners and different women who I'm working with and those types of things, and sometimes there's that idea that I'll just take Vitex or insert new, like supplement here and it'll fix it. So when a woman is experiencing these types of symptoms related to adrenal fatigue, the interplay of hormones that's going on between the cortisol and how it's impacting progesterone, estrogen, and all the other things that we've spoken about, why might taking one supplement type of thing not why does that potentially not help the situation? Just focusing on I'll just take one thing, or because I think that the kind of mindset that I'm getting at, that's kind of how we've been taught that if this is a problem, then we can take this and that'll fix it for us.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of anything that's complicated in this world, the this for that treatment model doesn't work. And it could be anything. You could look at, in my hometown, Oakland, California, where I live, high school dropout rates. I forget the numbers my son was telling me, something like half the kids in his high school, half the boys in his high school are never going to graduate from high school. So can his high school just, put in a special math tutoring class and that solves the problem? No, because half these kids don't even have the money to get to school, or they're not even eating lunch, It's a pretty systemic problem with poverty and social injustice and all this kind of stuff. So whenever we try to intervene in a complex system, whether it's schools or prisons or, some impoverished country where we're trying to change things, it just, you can't just do a one-shot fix, right? The same thing in the human body. We're looking at interactive systems. And in the way that I teach this in my training programs, we're looking at neuroendocrine, which is what we're talking about today. It's the brain and the hormones. We're looking at digestive function, and we're looking at detox capacity. And so whenever there's a hormone problem, especially with the female hormones, there's going to be a brain component for sure. There's going to be a digestive component contributing to the issue, and there's going to be some kind of toxin related problem. Because a lot of the toxins that we're exposed to are endocrine disruptors, right? One of the main things that they do is they disrupt the production and processing and metabolism of hormones in the body. And so you can't look at, I'd like to say that the classic thing that we see in natural health probably is a woman does a test for progesterone, or maybe doesn't even do a test, and starts to take some progesterone cream, hoping that that's going to fix her levels, when in fact the progesterone is low because of emotional, dietary, and inflammatory stresses that involve the brain, the gut, and the detox systems. So female hormones are, I think, the classic example of how we shouldn't approach things on a this for that basis. It just doesn't work very well either. Most women are not going to get a magic cure and all of a sudden have normal sex drive and really good quality sleep and be fertile just because they take a little bit of progesterone,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And so now that, we've delved into so much of this and really laid it out, What are some of the ways that you approach these issues with clients? Maybe you could talk a little bit about your approach and how you work with your female clients to start balancing their hormone levels and addressing these imbalances.
Okay, so there's two big categories. One is, lifestyle changes that people have to make, and then the other is labs and supplement programs. So on the lifestyle side, we look at sleep, exercise, what you're eating, and meditation, kind of stress reduction, right? So those four. Sometimes that's enough. Most of the time it's not. Then on the other side, on the lab-based sort of functional medicine treatment side, we look at neuroendocrine, right, brain and hormone systems through lab testing. Do a lot of testing for digestive health and functioning of the gut. That relates to two things, and primarily one is what foods are good for you, what foods should you avoid, and then do you have any pathogens or gut infections, which are really common in fertility cases, believe it or not. And then we look at detoxification systems. So neuroendocrine, GI, and detox. And detox systems basically are when your body's exposed to an environmental toxin. It could be benzene, toluene, it could be lead, mercury, cadmium. It could be because you're, putting a plastic around your food and then putting it in a microwave and heating it up, whatever it is that is potentially an endocrine disruptor. It's going to get into your system. It's going to throw off the way that we process and utilize hormones. So we always check neuroendocrine, GI, and detox systems with lab testing and then fix each one of those systems. And, this is such a simple thing that, it's almost embarrassing to say, but there was this moment, I was probably in practice for like 8 or 9 years, and I'd worked with a lot of fertility patients at that point. And, we had a whole wall in the office of the pictures of the babies of the women that we'd helped and all this kind of stuff. And I just realized one day that, wow, the natural tendency, which is a very powerful tendency in nature, is for women to get pregnant really easily. And really, it's a matter of what's putting the brakes on that process. And we remove the brakes, we get women healthy overall, brain, gut, and toxin-related health comes back, and then the pregnancies happen almost effortlessly. But something simple, like a Giardia infection in your gut, or an environmental toxin like mercury, could block the ability of your body from getting pregnant. We have to identify those blocks and remove them and let nature do its thing. That's basically how we work. And it's a powerful, it sounds so simple, but it's really powerful technique to just get women healthy at this fundamental level and to address the problems of our time, which are poor food quality, digestive tract issues, emotional stress, and then this whole toxic burden that we're all under.
Well, I think a really interesting perspective, on what you're talking about there is basically when her body is not healthy, right, then her body is preventing her from getting pregnant because her body's saying, look, this isn't a good time. You're stressed the heck out. You've got an infection here. You've got these toxic exposure. This is not a good time. And so we're going to protect you by not putting an additional stress of a pregnancy on your body. Is that something that you've kind of come to just with all of your years of working with women?
Yeah, that's the design team's plan here. Whoever set this whole system up, right, is that when women are stressed enough, emotional, dietary, inflammatory stress, cortisol levels skyrocket, thyroid hormone levels plummet, estrogen and progesterone levels get all out of balance, and it's hard to get pregnant. So the body basically prioritizes survival over reproduction, meaning that if you're in a fight for survival and you're, running away from that car in the crosswalk every day, but that car is really like your boss that you don't like, or a bad marriage, or whatever it is that's stressing you out, it's going to just make it really hard to get pregnant. And I think you're right. In a way, it's sort of a protective mechanism that keeps women from, historically, getting pregnant when their tribe was out of food and they're wandering across the desert, or they're in the 4th year of a war with the neighboring tribe in the island over there, or whatever it is that was stressing us out in times past. It's just that the stresses now are just everywhere, and they're not limited to extraordinary events. The stresses are just our lives, our lack of sleep, our lack of ability to take vacations and breaks, people working several jobs, commuting really long hours. Someone told me yesterday that in France, they're on the verge of banning and making illegal work-related emails in the evenings or weekends. And if you even said that here where I live in Silicon Valley, you'd probably be like kidnapped and taken away by the Google police or Apple police or Intel's police or Facebook's police, secret police force or something like that, right? I mean, we're working really hard here in Silicon Valley. People work around the clock to make these tech companies run. And it's pretty hard to get pregnant in an environment like that.
Well, and so I would be curious to be a fly on the wall when you're meeting with a patient, because this is the last thing that a patient wants to hear. It's almost like you're saying it's your fault because you're not managing your stress well enough. And it's also so much easier to go to the health food store and buy like a vitamin B complex than it is to address the systemic issues that are causing you stress. I know I have a habit of getting to sleep really late, and it's ingrained, like 33 years and strong. These are not things that are easy to fix. So how does that conversation go when you're working with clients? How do you really support your clients in trying to make some of these changes, which are some of the hardest changes to make?
Well, I mean, I think if we're just talking about fertility, when women are having trouble getting pregnant, they're not feeling very good anyways. Even just take away the whole I can't get pregnant problem, they're going to be tired, depressed, anxious, have digestive problems, be eating too much sugar. They're not, the reason why they got to this place where they are struggling with getting pregnant is tied in with the fact that they're not healthy and that they just don't feel super great anyways. And so taking a woman like that and doing something artificial to get her pregnant and then having a depressed, overweight, unhealthy new mom is not a really great thing, And so I think if there's time and the woman's young enough, it's worth taking 6 months or a year to get yourself super healthy and prepare yourself for, all the stresses that are going to come about when you have a little, I was going to say bundle of joy, but, a little monster that's crying all night and that, has no semblance of how to feed him or herself, doesn't even know when to sleep, can't even go to the bathroom on their own. I mean, you're just going to have this little beast of, we call a baby, that you're in charge of. And going into that experience, exhausted and depressed and anxious, is pretty tough.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I feel like I've kind of touched on that in a number of episodes, just in the importance of actually being healthy and being in a good emotional state before your life is turned upside down into chaos. I mean, motherhood is a beautiful thing, but it's also very real. I probably have, I have a 9-month-old, so I probably have vomit on me right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a beautiful thing, but it's real.
Well, no one tells you any of this stuff. When my son was born, I mean, he's 17 now. He's going out into the world. He's a great kid. He's all grown up. But when he was born, I still remember this. I'm holding him there. I'm in the delivery room. I'm holding him, and I looked at his mom, and she just didn't even have the energy to cuddle him. She was just like, get that thing out of here. Let me just lie here for a few minutes and get myself together. It wasn't like this, the music came on and the lights came up and she was like this anointed mom. She's just like, can I have a break? You just take him in the other room. And that, I mean, we both love him tremendously, but it's a challenge. There's a lot of challenges. And I think going into it at your peak health, and understanding what that means, how to figure out how to get to your peak health is pretty important.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, postpartum depression is a thing for a reason. So I would imagine, based on just no scientific research that I've done today, that if you're already in a kind of depressed state, emotionally, hormonally, you're stressed out, your kind of nutrient stores depleted, et cetera, that probably doesn't help, in terms of the emotional state that you'll have afterwards. So I feel like that's such an important point. I feel like that drive to get pregnant and the get pregnant being the goal, it's really important, but it kind of misses the point that you're building a family. So it's more than the getting pregnant piece. And it's kind of, what are you going to be like after this process? Because you still have to take care of the baby. But I digress.
Yeah. Well, and this is another thing too, and this comes up a lot with my patients, which is that you want to be the best mom that you can be, And if the kids are coming home with muddy shoes and you're yelling at them because they're walking in with muddy shoes, which is a normal thing for every kid on the planet to do, then, you might be, as a new mom, kind of on the edge and not at your best emotional state, And that really colors the interactions and the levels of patience that you can have for raising young kids. So I think it goes beyond just a pregnancy issue and also just to what happens in those first, 3, 4, 5 years when you have a toddler and you're dealing with all the challenges there.
Well, and I think you touched on this as well. You mentioned if a woman is young enough, then, you can work with someone and potentially take, 6 months to really work on these things, to improve the diet, get the sleep under control, manage the stress, and, do all the things that are going to optimize your health. How do you address these same issues when you're working with a client who is already, say, 39, 40, 41?
Yeah, this happened this morning. I have a 39-year-old patient this morning, and I don't know. I wouldn't say she's in a panic, but she's in a mild panic about, how is this all going to work? And I'm out of time, and so this all has to happen right away. And oftentimes it works like this, right? Because people wait till the last minute for everything, don't they? And it just, it takes away the luxury of being able to plan things carefully and puts us into sort of urgent mode. And I think certain things take on an exaggerated importance. So, like, for example, you could probably cheat on your diet if you had tons of extra time. If you don't, you got to be much more careful with your diet. You could probably not get a lot of sleep if you have more time. If you're in a short time frame, then you have to be much more careful about sleep. So all the lifestyle factors, sleep, exercise, what you're eating, and meditation and relaxation just become exaggerated in their importance. They become kind of, you have to do them, it's not optionals. But it's still doable. Probably more often than not, we get women who are wanting to get pregnant and behind schedule. And that's why they're coming in, because usually they'll try more conventional fertility treatments first and then end up stumbling into an office like mine when things aren't going as well as they wanted.
Mm-hmm. Well, and something just popped into my mind. I'd be curious to hear, because you kind of assume that if a woman's trying to get pregnant, she's going to be, eating this optimal diet and et cetera, et cetera. But, in your clinical experience, if a woman kind of regularly consumes a bit of alcohol or a lot of alcohol here and there, how do you find that impacts her hormonal levels, or have you found that it does?
Well, alcohol, think about it in terms of body systems, right? So we've got neuroendocrine, GI, and detox. So alcohol is going to affect, obviously, your detox system because your body has to break all the alcohol down. It also is a really powerful, blood sugar destabilizer because alcohol is all sugar, right? And so that's going to throw off your hormones right away. It would be this equivalent of having a pint of ice cream in terms of sugar, right? You're going to see that a large amount of alcohol, even a couple of glasses of wine, is enough sugar in a concentrated form all at one time to destabilize your blood sugar. And then what happens is your blood sugars go up because of the alcohol. Your body releases a ton of insulin to bring the sugar down in the bloodstream. And then your body, in response to that, releases a bunch of cortisol, which I mentioned earlier is a glucocorticosteroid, right? It's a blood sugar stabilizer. So you end up on this little blood sugar roller coaster, up and down, cortisol up and down. And as the cortisol fluctuates, the female hormones start to take a hit. Now, a lot of women figure this out intuitively, and they actually use alcohol, wine. It's always wine. I don't know why. 25 years, 100% of the time it's wine. They use wine to actually modulate fluctuations in their female hormones. And they'll typically follow the same pattern where mid-20s, early 30s, they drink wine occasionally. All of a sudden, mid-30s, late 30s, early 40s, they start to drink a glass or two of wine almost every day. And what they don't realize is that as their estrogen levels are starting to decline from all the stress, they're using alcohol to bring up or normalize the dip in the female hormones. That's a really common pattern.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It's always wine. 100% of the time it's wine. I don't know why. It's never like vodka or gin. And it's not really alcoholism in the true sense of it, because once you point this out, and they stop drinking the alcohol, no problem. But they're using the alcohol to modulate the declining estrogen, basically.
That's really interesting. There's just something special about vino. And so then if a woman is trying to get pregnant, does that mean that she has to cut out all of the wine? Or how do you counsel clients about the wine? Or it's always the wine, so the wine.
Yeah, I mean, alcohol 100% out for sure. Sugar maybe a little bit, a couple times a week if you have to. I don't think that's going to cause a big problem. And then one of the biggest factors we see, not for every woman, but for some women, is the reactions that gluten can cause. And there's a stack of research like 3 inches thick, almost all of it produced in Europe, about the connection between infertility and gluten sensitivity or celiac disease. That's something that's been researched for decades and is very well known outside of the United States. And what's really funny about doctors in the United States is for some reason they believe the American scientific literature, but they don't believe, French or Italian research studies. And they just don't have the same weight here. It's kind of funny. You think that, I don't know, I mean, they were practicing science over in Europe while we were still like banging rocks together here, But gluten sensitivity, and all your patients or your clients should Google this one or go to PubMed and look it up. Gluten and its reactions or relationships with infertility. That's pretty well documented. So getting off of gluten, getting off of alcohol, a little bit of sugar here and there is probably about what we usually expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine that's an interesting conversation, because these are habits. Whether it's sugar or whether it's gluten. Gluten's a hard one too because gluten is in everything.
Yeah, it forces you to eat things like vegetables and fruit a lot, basically.
Yeah, no, for sure. And so part of the work that you do with women, then you have a really specific methodology when it comes to lab testing. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about your month-long lab testing where you kind of really delve into the hormone levels.
Yeah, so the same group of doctors I mentioned earlier, somewhere around early 1980s, started to apply the salivary testing of for female hormones in addition to the adrenal hormones. And so this was a clever idea because what they wanted to do was look at hormone levels every day of the cycle and map out that particular woman's individual cycle. And so obviously it's pretty inconvenient to get your blood drawn every day of the month. No one would do that. So this had never really been done in a practical form before. And they took a group of somewhere around 200 or 300 women, early 20s from UCLA, students at the college there, because the lab was in LA at the time, and they mapped out their female hormone cycle. And ever since then, there's been a variety of functional medicine labs throughout the United States that do these month-long panels. And it's really simple. You spit into a tube every other day for a month. You throw them all in the freezer, and then when you're done at the end of the month, you send them into the lab. And the lab company will map out your daily production of progesterone and estrogen throughout the month. And it's a fascinating test. It's not that well known, and it's not used that often, in part because it's challenging to interpret it. And so again, I was in the right place at the right time, and the doctors that basically created the idea of doing this test were trained me for many, many years, 6 or 7 years I spent with them, learning how to interpret these labs. And that's part of what I teach in my training program now as well, is how to interpret these month-long panels. It's pretty complicated, so a lot of practitioners avoid it just because they're not sure exactly what to do with the responses that they get back. But to me, it's like the best way to look at why is there a fertility problem in the first place. And you'll see things like the total production of progesterone and estrogen for the month. You'll see the timing and when there are spikes or drops in progesterone or estrogen. You'll see when ovulation occurs and how powerful the ovulation is. You see the output of progesterone right after ovulation. All the things that are related to a woman getting pregnant easily are revealed on that test. And so the most common pattern that we see on the month-long panel is that the woman is ovulating, but she's either ovulating a little early or a little late, and there's an insufficient response of progesterone to ovulation. That's a really common pattern we see all the time. And then the lab tells you exactly how much progesterone she needs, exactly what days of the month she needs to take it, so you can reset the normal cycle. And just as I was saying, the adrenal rhythm, and we produce cortisol in a 24-hour cycle. Women produce estrogen and progesterone in a roughly 28-day cycle. And when you see the 28-day lab test results, you know what the normals should be. You can reset whatever problems you see with a month-long panel back to normal hormone output. And again, it always ends up being the same thing. If you're producing the normal amount of progesterone at the right time of the month, then you're going to hit your maximum fertility. If you're underproducing progesterone at certain key points of the month, it's going to be hard to either get pregnant or to stay pregnant once you are pregnant.
And is what you mentioned kind of that targeted progesterone where you're giving her progesterone at a specific time of the month, or is that just for some patients, or is it like you're working with her body to figure out how to get her body to be more efficient and more effective in producing more progesterone?
It's kind of all those things. So when we see what the labs are, you see what days of the month progesterone levels are low, and then you give specific amounts of progesterone just on those days to bring the levels back up to where they should be. So what you're doing is normalizing you're looking at the internal production and then making up for the difference, yeah? Mm-hmm. And when the body starts to see this normal rhythm coming back, it triggers the internal production to restore. It's the same with the adrenal hormone protocols. When we look at an adrenal lab and you see the cortisol throughout the day, we're using supplements to restore internal production back to normal so you don't get dependent on the program. And it turns out just having a normal adrenal rhythm and a normal female hormone rhythm puts a woman at a place where she can get pregnant really easily. So we're not trying to fake anything. We're just trying to reestablish normal production and normal patterns.
Well, that's really interesting. And then, so when you do that, does the woman then end up taking this targeted progesterone kind of indefinitely? If she gets pregnant, does she still have to take it during her pregnancy?
No, because you're resetting the internal production. That's the whole point. I had this OBGYN in my training program, I don't know, maybe like 5-6 years ago. And when he was in my class, in like the second or third month of the class, he already had 4 of his fertility patients that were pregnant. I mean, this isn't that hard to do. If you get a smart doctor, you can teach him how to do this pretty quickly. I mean, it took this guy like 60 days to figure out everything I'm talking about, and he had a whole group of patients pregnant a month later. Okay, but the reason why it's so easy is because the tendency of the body, the desire, I mean, all of nature is pushing towards fertility, obviously, or we wouldn't be standing here talking to each other, right? I mean, this is the whole drive of nature is for us to reproduce. And so if you get even close to what normal production is, women get pregnant really easily. You then stop the treatment, and, we're trying to, again, reestablish normal production levels. So the programs, are short term. And when the internal production comes back, we stop all the extra support.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting as well because, so in the podcast, I've interviewed a number of different people. One of the women that I interviewed is a medical doctor who is trained in something called NAPRO technology. And so what you're talking about is very similar to kind of one of their protocols with in terms of the progesterone. And I think it's really interesting. A question I'd have for you, because we hear so much about progesterone cream. And I'm guessing that not all practitioners who potentially use it in their practice do a full month hormone panel on their clients to determine which days would be appropriate to give them progesterone. So how does your targeted approach then differ to the approach that would typically be applied for women in the situation?
Well, I think in general, most women probably aren't tested, and they're just given progesterone with the assumption that they're low. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just not as careful as you could be. Because when you see a month-long panel, you can tell the woman exactly what day and how much progesterone she should take for every day of the month. So it's just much more specific. And then the creams you can't really use the creams with the protocols that I do because you can't tell a woman, you need 2 milligrams of progesterone on this day and then 7 milligrams over here. It's just impossible to get the creams dosed that well because it's a cream and you can't tell exactly how much is in it. and how much you're applying. There's no way to regulate the application so you can get, specific enough. I'm not against the use of the creams, but if you really want to get to the nitty gritty and do this, with precision, then we end up using either a pill form or a liquid form of the progesterone instead of creams.
Yeah. What I also find really interesting as well is, given that the whole fertility awareness thing means that you're charting your cycles, and then you can see like when you ovulate and how long your cycles are. Most women don't have 28-day cycles. I mean, there's variation there. So I think it's really interesting, your protocol as well, because then you're fully looking at exactly what's happening and really doing what needs to be done on the particular day that it needs to be done on, instead of assuming that every woman has a 28-day cycle and being like, okay, so this has to be done on day 21, when that might have no relevance for that particular woman.
As a matter of fact, it could be the opposite of what she needs if you don't have a lab. You can't guess what day she's high or low in progesterone, or what, I mean, sometimes we'll see things like maybe she's ovulating on day 8. Yeah. Doesn't matter how much progesterone you give around day 15. I mean, if the cycle is that far off, it's going to be pretty hard to get pregnant. Or you might see progesterone levels completely failing on day 17 and on day 20, and if you miss that window and you don't support her progesterone on day 17, it's going to be hard for her to maintain a pregnancy. So yeah, I think the more specific we get, the more impactful the programs can be.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm sure that a lot of the clients, or I think I can safely say the majority of your female clients at some point in their history have been on some form of hormonal birth control. Have you seen a connection then between hormonal birth control and these adrenal issues that we've been talking about? Or even if you could just speak to how you found that a history of hormonal birth control use might impact her hormones?
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever seen a direct impact on the adrenals so much, on the adrenal hormone labs, but definitely when we look at the month-long panels, we see not every woman that's on birth control has some percent. I'm not sure which percent. I've never seen anyone research it, but a certain percentage of women who are on birth control, when they get off of birth control, their cycle just doesn't bounce back to its normal, perfect self. And so the most disrupted rhythms that we see on the months are consistently from women who were on birth control, got off the birth control, and never had their cycle really come back exactly right. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't always happen, right? Sometimes women stop birth control and they get pregnant a few months later and everything's working fine. But there's a certain subset of people who don't reset after birth control. And we test, obviously, when we run these labs, this is a really distorted view, right? Because we're obviously testing people who have problems. We're never testing the people who went off of birth control and they got pregnant right away. So we have a kind of distorted worldview of all this because we're always looking at women that have problems with the testing.
Hmm. So then for a woman to have a healthy menstrual cycle kind of overall, so kind of like to summarize what we've been talking about today, what factors are necessary then for a woman to have a healthy menstrual cycle?
So three big variables, I guess three big variables really is probably the easiest way to look at it. Figuring out how you're going to address the stress, whether it's exercising better, eating better, figuring out more free time, whatever it is, better sleep quality, dealing with the stress component. That's going to calm down your brain. And then second is making sure your digestion is working really well, because that's sort of the hidden generator of inflammation most of the time that's disrupting hormones. I know it seems strange, but it's just what we see with these labs. Most common pattern is some kind of odd gut infection or some food reaction or something that's inflaming the gut that's throwing the hormones off. And then the third variable, and it's kind of in a way a more interesting topic, but probably not quite as important, is making sure that you're staying away from as much as you can or getting rid of environmental toxins that can act as hormone disruptors. That's pretty important. So those are the three big ones. Those are the three big issues probably.
Okay, and could we delve into just a little bit deeper the gut connection, because I think that I kind of know that obviously if your gut is a total mess, then your hormones are going to be impacted. But Why is there such a strong connection between the gut and then your hormones?
Yeah, so when the digestive tract is inflamed, you make a lot of anti-inflammatory responses, and one of the main anti-inflammatory hormones is cortisol. So right away, you've got this hormonal reaction as your body's trying to deal with inflammation. Cortisol goes up. Then the next thing that happens is the thyroid hormone levels drop, and then progesterone and estrogen drop. And testosterone drops as well for men and women. So the more inflamed you are, basically, the more messed up your cortisol, thyroid, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone are. So it doesn't matter where the inflammation is coming from. And we tend to, just because of the way we live and current culture, generate the bulk of our inflammation in the gut. And that has to do with, choosing foods that are pro-inflammatory, not eating anti-inflammatory foods. That's code word for vegetables and fruit. Not, alcohol, obviously really pro-inflammatory. And then this is the strangest one. That's going to probably freak people out the most when they hear this, but half the women that we test have chronic digestive tract infections. Microscopic bugs in their gut, whether it's bacteria or yeast or parasitic overgrowth, and those little bugs in the gut cause a lot of inflammation and a lot of digestive tract problems that will tie up the hormones as quickly as eating the wrong foods will.
Yeah, I guess that's pretty gross when I think about that, to think that you have a gut infection, an overgrowth of something in there.
It's so common, that you wouldn't even believe it. And it's, again, a source of inflammation, which is going to dysregulate all the hormones.
Well, and when it comes to then one of the other things that you mentioned, which is the environmental exposures, and you had touched on xenoestrogens. I think I got a question from a woman recently, and it was kind of like, okay, but you're saying that it's a xenoestrogen, like it's an estrogen, but you're telling me that my estrogen might be low. So why isn't, it's kind of like if I'm being exposed to all these estrogens, then, why, I think what's the difference there between xenoestrogen? How does your body respond to these foreign estrogens versus how your body responds to your own natural estrogens?
So the problem is that xenoestrogens, and this could be like derivatives of plastic manufacturing. If you look around you, if I look around the room I'm in right now, I can see like literally 20 things that are made out of plastic. There's a lot of plastic in the world, so we're exposed to that a lot. The xenoestrogens from plastic. It could be from other chemical compounds or heavy metals, whatever it might be. Those chemical compounds are, they can do a couple things. Well, one is that if they get into your liver, which is where they ultimately all end up, when your liver's trying, it's going to interfere with your body's ability to process all the stuff it's supposed to be processing, like your normal healthy estrogen. The other thing is that a lot of these chemical compounds act as what you mentioned, xenoestrogens. So in addition to just generally damaging your liver and generally damaging your ability to process hormones, they're going to specifically be similar enough to the real estrogen to hit the cell receptor sites for estrogen and trigger a response. But they're not the real estrogen, so the response that they trigger is inappropriate. And, all kinds of bad things can happen when that occurs. Probably the biggest thing that we should all be worried about would be some kind of, excess growth or cell growth that we would call cancer, right? Because estrogen is a growth hormone. And if you have a lot of these signals going out for excessive estrogen the effect of the cell receptors responding to these chemical compounds is going to be a pretty negative thing, not only for fertility issues, but sort of general health. Then on the estrogen production side, like how much estrogen your body is actually making. Some women make too much estrogen. Some women are underproducing estrogen, but in a way that's an independent variable from your burden of xenoestrogens, right? So these two things are happening simultaneously. So you could have a lot of xenoestrogens, the bad chemical compounds, and either high estrogen that you're making internally or low estrogen. Mm-hmm. Right? They're separate issues. One is, what are your ovaries deciding to do every day in terms of producing hormones, and the other is how much of these environmental poisons are you getting exposed to in your system, and how well can you get rid of them?
Yeah, no, there's a lot going on there, and at the end of the day, it sounds like you're trying to get the stressors off the body, kind of give your body a chance to restore itself by kind of taking some of the things off of its plate, like give your liver a break, let it do what it's supposed to be doing instead of continually bombarding it with plastics and foreign chemicals. And it's hard as a woman because I did a whole episode on xenoestrogens. Like, it's hard. The lotions, everything that is on TV that you're supposed to pretty yourself up with is messing with your hormones. Like every lotion, body wash, soap, nail polish, all of it. So it's kind of hard as a woman with all that stuff coming at you.
Yeah, most people aren't aware that's even a problem until they get sick or have something that happens health-wise.
Yeah. Well, to wrap up our interview today, I have a few final questions. And the first one I'd like to ask is, what would you say is the biggest myth about fertility that you'd like to see corrected?
Well, that's a really good question. Oh, wow. Well, you know what? Just from personal experience, I don't know if this is a fertility myth, but it's something that I've seen, which is just like a deal breaker, is that I've had several couples over the years where we did a fertility program and the woman became pregnant and it was an absolute disaster. This happened to me several times. And so an absolute disaster because, in fact, the relationship wasn't solid enough, and there was a reason why she wasn't getting pregnant that was more on the emotional front, because she wasn't sure this was the right person to be with, wasn't sure it was the right time to get pregnant. So I'd say just make sure that you don't get caught up in needing to get pregnant and ignore the fact that your partner is an alcoholic, or that, maybe it would be better if you waited for a few years until something else, changed in your life. And that just make sure that, that you're really ready. Because these natural fertility programs are really effective, and it's not that hard to make all this happen for people.
That's a hard-hitting point, I think.
I know. It's happened to me like 2 or 3 times. I thought I'd save the day. Oh, you're pregnant. I'm so happy. And then the woman's just like in tears, and she's like, no, this is the wrong person. I shouldn't be doing this. And,
wow. That just gave me goosebumps. All right. What advice, if any, would you give to a woman or a couple then who is struggling to conceive?
Well, for sure, couples. Do it. Do all these protocols that we're talking about together, because it's really hard for one person in the partnership to eat super healthy and the other person not. And that part of restoring your fertility is basically just getting super healthy in all these different ways that we've kind of lost track of in our modern life. And when you do get super healthy, the fertility kind of comes along with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and last question of the day, for a woman who is currently on the pill or some other hormonal contraceptive, and she knows she doesn't want to get pregnant right now, but she's thinking about getting pregnant within the next couple of years, what advice, if any, would you give to her?
So I always ask for a year of lead time. So if a patient comes in and she says, I'm 30, I found the right person, I definitely want to have kids, we're getting married, and all this, whatever is happening, good stuff, then I'll say, okay, great. Well, why don't we, about a year from the time when you want to start to get pregnant, run all these labs, give us plenty of time to get everything fixed that we find, so we're not in any kind of rush or constraint in terms of time, which is, oftentimes what ends up happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, excellent words to end on today. Thank you so much for being here today. It was just a pleasure chatting with you, and I really appreciate your perspective and you taking the time to share all of your wisdom and knowledge with us today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
And for our listeners then, how can they get in touch with you and find out more about the work that you do?
Yeah, so I work with patients over the phone throughout the world, and the patient website is kalishwellness.com, so Kalish wellness.com.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/84. If you have been enjoying the podcast, please look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. And make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com and join my mailing list. If you have an idea for a podcast episode or a guest suggestion, send me an email at info@fertilityfriday.com. I've been getting some awesome emails, ideas, great ideas for a show, great ideas for guests. So keep them coming. And thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I appreciate all of you for taking the time to tune into the podcast and letting me be a part of your day. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.